All right. Well, I suspect we're going to continue to have people sort of, trickle in, but because you have a hard stop and out of respect for time and because it's recorded, yeah, I think we're going to go ahead and proceed. For folks that are on the live Zoom or for folks that are watching this recorded at a later date, welcome to the first UTRF Tech Talk of 2022. As always, this is a seminar series that UTRF puts on to highlight and inform in any area related to intellectual property, to tech transfer, to research commercialization or entrepreneurship. Today, I'm thrilled to have an outside speaker, Jim Stefansic, talk from Raiven Healthcare, talking about enhancing healthcare with artificial intelligence, the wild west of data analytics and value. Jim, take it away.
Hey, thanks, Richard. Thanks. Always good to see the folks from UTRF and others on the line. Happy to be here. I'll probably talk for about 35 minutes, trying to keep things interesting. I'll cover a lot of different topics, a little bit around IP towards the end, and then just some ideas of where I think this is going. But first, just a little on my background. So I got a PhD in biomedical engineering from Vandy. I've done a lot of tech transfer, including my own PhD work out of Vandy. And the technology that Raiven has, we actually was a tech transfer out of Indiana University. I am a director at Raiven now, so I'm on the board. I actually sold the company last year. I had been like sitting on it. I couldn't really do much with the technology, unfortunately, and I'll give you a sense as to why this has been so hard. I think you'll figure it out, but fortunately, the guys that bought it are want to resurrect this technology, which is exciting. So we actually bought all the IP, the patents, and everything, and so we own it all. And we're moving forward on a few initiatives. But haven't quit my day job. I'm still primarily employed at Cumberland Emerging Technologies. So we're here in the Gulch. I'm in my office here in Nashville, the Gulch in Nashville, where we have life science space, and we do early stage asset kind of commercialization, mostly around drugs, drug development, kind of past the drug discovery stage. So if you're in town anytime, you want to see the facility, just let me know. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me pretty easily, but happy to show you around here. So AI. So where are we with AI? I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Gardner life cycle curves. These are really interesting. They come out with these every year. And so it's been kind of interesting to follow this along my pathway. So we started Raiven in 2015, and I suspected that AI wasn't really at its peak yet, peak of inflated expectation as it was. And so I thought we got some time to kind of figure this out. But it is really, AI is still, it's still not used that often in healthcare, period. And it's still really hard to do it. And I'll talk a little bit about that. What I find interesting is, so this one's more focused on just technologies in general. The one, let me turn on my pointer. This one on the left is focused just basically on technologies in general. And on the right, I downloaded one recently from 2021. So this is from 2018. So really what we're providing is PaaS, which is kind of like a product as a service, or process as a service for our technologies, how I kind of envisioned it being commercialized, which is really kind of like a cloud service. So you can see we've kind of gotten over this hump, but we're still, we haven't even gotten to the trough of disillusionment yet on it, which is understandable. I mean, people hear that AI is going to like take over the world and everything, but really what's happened. What I found interesting on the most recent one of these is two things that I think could really be a game changers for AI are everybody talks about how much data you need. Now I'm going to prove to you, you don't need a lot of data. So this idea of small and wide data, basically diverse, really rich data, but you don't need a whole lot of it to answer some questions. And then synthetic data, which is essentially making some like basically made up data to help train your algorithm. Those are both on the curve now. Early on, they're still early, and it looks like they're going to have some ways to go to get for people to really understand how to use them. But I just found that to be fascinating. And one of the biggest venture capitalists in the field is a guy named Vinod Khosla. He's out in Silicon Valley. He's got a firm called Khosla Ventures. We actually pitched Raiven to his firm. They didn't invest, but he's like all in on this, and he's made a lot of money over the years betting on technology. So I think it's pretty exciting that he's, that he says these kind of things, but we'll see if it really pans out. I think it's still pretty much maximum hype. I mean, all the articles coming out, it's like robots are going to take over the world. They're going to take our jobs. Now with, virtual, more remote work, it's like robots can come in and do some of the things you can do in your job. And I mean, where are we with that? I think there's still a lot of hype. The reality is, sometimes the more simple solutions that we need to solve with AI that could be done don't really need AI. So if you're going after a hard problem, if you want to solve a really hard problem, that makes sense. You want AI to solve something hard. Solving easy stuff, humans do that pretty well. So why do you really need AI to do that? I'll give some examples. So my talk focuses mostly on healthcare, but I'll touch on some other topics as well. So one of the topics of the conversation is value. Like, what's the value that you could get from AI? Well, interestingly, when Cleveland Clinic has done this, I think they've repeated this study and gotten very similar results. But looking at if you go into the doctor and you get your initial diagnosis, what are the chances that someone else would think differently? Another physician, another nurse, whoever. It's pretty high. It's pretty staggering. Especially changes to your treatment plan, right? Because maybe they diagnose you correctly, but you suffer longer than you need to because of a treatment that's not known, or a path you could go on. Path will be the key word here when we talk about Raiven's technology and some of these technologies. So I find it interesting that's the case. And a lot of this is because, and this is even worse now than when I gave this presentation, this parts of presentation I gave about a year and a half ago. Especially the pandemic, the lack of the workforce in healthcare in the U.S. has really come to light. Things are delayed. Information takes longer to get where it needs to go. Things fall through the crack, and there's cognitive errors that are caused because you don't have access to all the information, the clinical reasoning. And this is scary in what's supposedly supposed to be the greatest country in the world, that we have these kind of issues, and you see these kind of percentages. So even think about that as you think about where AI could fit in. And then of course nobody's perfect. I mean, it's obvious that 50% of physicians graduate in the bottom of their class. So people have limitations. They have biases. They don't always think with a practical sense. Emotion can come into play, other things. And what I found really interesting was the single most common cause of diagnostic error was premature closure, meaning that it was a failure of the physician to consider reasonable alternatives after kind of an initial diagnosis was reached. So that's kind of scary when you think about that. It's like, hey, I got this patient. I'm moving on to my next patient. This is what's wrong with you. Let's get you down this treatment pathway. Because they're rushed, because it's still a fee for service kind of business, and so there's a lot of churn and getting patients through. So another thing to consider when you think about AI. So what about evidence-based medicine? You say, like, we do all this research at UT, research at Vanderbilt, all this research to come up with these findings that physicians have access to. Yeah, they can't read every journal, but they go to conferences, they learn things. Well, a lot of the research is it's not reproducible, and people have problems with that. They think they're being misled, but oftentimes, I think it's because there's nobody that's really normal, right? I mean, you have normal subjects And what does that really mean to be a normal clinical trial subject when you're looking at a study? And this is why real world data is so important. We'll talk more about data. It's got to be documented. It's got to be measured. And it'd be nice if it was done in a systematic way, but unfortunately, we're not there. But that's just something to consider. So we moved a little bit onto value now, more around data, and something you'll see when I talk about the Raiven technology. I've learned a lot about how important, it's pretty obvious, but how important data is to AI, and not only the data, but just the frustrations of getting the right data, getting the right quality data, and then some of our success around getting the rich data that I'll talk about. But there's all kinds of devices out there, some of which don't even exist anymore. This is a jawbone. We used this for actually one of our studies I'll show you with some patients. The company doesn't even exist. They've been bought out. Of course, Apple's been trying to move into this space and have their own have it so that everything can be on your watch. I got my Apple Watch. I track everything on here, all my workouts, everything. It's kind of like attached to my body at this point. But there, as an aside, think about all the people that don't have access to this technology or really don't care if it does show all that information. How useful is that if you're not collecting it and doing something meaningful with it? But this is just, we're just scratching the surface on this and the opportunities that are there. And we'll see. It's probably going to take a company like Apple or Amazon really going all in on this and spending a lot of money to make this data in a format that will be useful, I think, other than for your own personal use, to really be used by physicians and caregivers to drive treatment. So we talked a little bit about value, talked a little bit about data. We're going to go back to data later, but I'm going to talk a little bit about what is kind of artificial intelligence, machine learning, just to get a framework here, and then talk about the Raiven technology, which we patented, and I can talk about some of the challenges of patenting this and why we have a patent, which is great, and we were able to leverage that when we sold the company, but they didn't really buy us because of the patent, and I'll explain why. But so machine learning is just a subset of artificial intelligence. So it's basically a way to program a computer so that it can learn over time. So you're not really programming it to do the same thing over and over again. You're programming it to learn. That's the simple. I'm not a data scientist, so I don't understand how all the algorithms work. I have read a few papers and things, but I wasn't the one coding the algorithms and designing the work. So I have no comments on that. So you can use machine learning to get into predictive, and where I think it's even more value is prescriptive analytics. So predictive is really you make a prediction as to what's going to happen next. Pretty straightforward. And you can also, with prescriptive, and this is kind of where Raiven, we have a kind of our seminal paper is in this book, because we were focused on mental health, and I'll talk more about that. But you focus on the sequences of treatments. When you start to get that complex, there's a really huge potential for AI, because if you're just saying if something's X is better than Y, most of the time that's just not useful information to the end user who's trying to make a decision. They probably could come to that insight pretty quickly. If it's not quickly, it would be within a reasonable enough time that why would they pay for this technology and all the work it would take to do that. But when you're talking about complex treatment, and I have an analogy coming up on the next slide, that's where AI has a lot of value. But now we're getting into complexity, and complexity is where it starts to get really, really difficult to apply AI, because the more complex the problem, the more challenges you have just even getting the information you need to solve the problem and then convincing the end user to use it because it's complex. So Raiven, I like to define our technology. Took me a while to come up with a good analogy, but essentially what we do and what our patents cover, which is pretty unique, is that we're trying to find the most effective pathway to get from point A to point B. So we know that a patient has, in our case, we really focused on mental health. So our partner here, how I got involved in this in Nashville was I worked with Centerstone Research Institute. So Centerstone of America is based here in Nashville. They're the largest provider of community-based mental health in the country. They were one of the first companies, mental health companies, to build their own EHR, which my co-founder kind of helped build from scratch, and to actually start to collect meaningful data in 2005. So they had, by the time I joined the company, they had been collecting, and we started the company, they'd been collecting mental health data for almost a decade, which was really exciting to me because, there wasn't, in 2014, there wasn't this kind of discussion when we were contemplating starting the company. So my co-founder came up with this algorithm that said, okay, if I have enough outcome data, if I have enough information about what happened to a patient over time, I should be able to use AI to prescribe a treatment pathway. And an analogy, the best analogy is like Waze for healthcare. You can kind of think of it as Waze for healthcare, right? So I'll show you an example of the technology, but think about when you're using Waze, if you've used it before. I'm not a huge Waze user. Unfortunately, I don't have to drive all over Nashville and deal with traffic where I live and work, but you drive and then it might tell you to make a left turn somewhere. And you're like, there's no way I'm going that way. Like, why is it telling me to go there? That is totally out of the way. Well, it's because it knows that 2 or 3 blocks ahead, there's a traffic accident or there's construction or something. And it's trying to tell you to maneuver around and get through to the next checkpoint so that you can get around whatever the bottleneck is. And oftentimes physicians they have the mental capacity to think 2 or 3 steps ahead. And I'm talking physician, but let's just talk clinicians in general. They absolutely have the ability to do that. I would trust most people that have MD after their name. They've done the training. They listen to a problem I have. They're thinking about what to do to help me get better. The question is, can they do it in the time frame they have? And do they have access to, can they go back in their collective memory and think about all the patients that have had my symptoms, my condition, and think about what might be the best pathway going forward? So that's the problem we're trying to solve with Raiven. Of course, physicians are very skeptical of this. This gets into the complexity of the problem you're trying to solve. The more complex the problem with the more kind of potential outcomes, I think the more skeptical physicians get, because, you're talking about a human being here and trying to make decisions. Having a computer make decisions for you based on data can be really daunting. And also there's this idea, this term wasn't around when I started Raiven, but now there's this idea of explainable AI, where one guy I'm working with now is trying to show me how all that works and how you can explain AI better to clinicians. But I'll tell you one thing, in mental health, for those of you that know people with mental illness or have experienced it yourself, which many of us have, talking to your primary care doctor is a critical part of that, right? You may have had your primary care doctor for years or decades, and they're who you trust to relate all these issues. And that doctor is not trained necessarily as a mental health provider, but has to think about possibilities for you and what to do for you to help you get over whatever you're doing. So this idea of having a computer in front of them that can cognitively offload what you're doing is really appealing. And that's what we learned a lot in our customer discovery was around that. So here's an example of how the Raiven technology works. So there's a patient, we'll call her Jennifer. She comes in, she's 85 years old. She suffers from diabetes and depression. Her husband just died. She's meeting with her primary care doctor, and her primary care doctor has 15 minutes with her. Now, Jennifer has a lot of comorbidities, right? So you're focused on her diabetes. Her primary care doctor is going to focus on her physical health first. That's just what they're trained to do. And fortunately, Jennifer's part of an ACO or an MCO where she has a care manager who can help her outside the clinic. So what we learned is how stressed out these care managers are. So this is Shannon. She's the care manager, and she's trying to figure out what's going to be best for Jennifer, right? I have limited number of resources, limited amount of time. I know that Jennifer's diabetes is being handled, but she's also depressed, and she's going to need some help coping with her with the loss of her spouse. And so what's the best way for me to treat her now? And this is where we were able to get enough data from the Centerstone database looking at tangible, quantifiable outcomes based on different treatment pathways over time. So it gets really complicated because not everybody does the same things. These little bubbles that show different things that you could do for Jennifer are different everywhere. They can somewhat be standardized. Obviously, going to visit a mental health provider is kind of standard. You visit a psychiatrist, a psychologist, medications, but what kind of medications? And then in our day and age now, there's with especially around care management and trying to treat the patient over time during an episode of care and save money. You can send someone to her house. You can engage with her on the phone or through other mechanisms, telehealth. So what's going to be best for Jennifer? Do we have enough data about that? And this is an example here of the technology. We never fully implemented this, unfortunately, but we got to a point where we could demonstrate that if you have these different pieces of information about Jennifer, you can and you're monitoring some sort of outcome. In this case, the outcome is this metric called PHQ-9, which if there's any psychiatrists on the phone, you're well aware of that. It's a 9 question questionnaire that you can describe. You can give a sense of your mental health state. So what's really important is you get this outcome data, because the outcome data, just like when you're driving down the road and you decide to go left or right, that's going to drive where the algorithm's going. And we could look weeks ahead in time and we could say, what's the right treatment pathway for Jennifer over time? And because we were able to get some payer data, although this shouldn't be the ultimate driving decision, you can find out where do you get the best bang for your buck. So what's the best cost per a unit of treatment for Jennifer? So that's the beauty of our technology and why I thought we would be able to be, we were at the cusp. We were kind of ahead of the game. We were ahead of the curve, on the wave at that point. But the challenges were, I'll talk a little bit more about that with data, was that nothing is standardized. Everybody does things differently. And we had first tailored this to a physician when we really needed was to talk to these people, the case managers. The physicians were not dealing with this. It's the case managers that were dealing with Jennifer over a course of time and wanted to do the right thing for her. We had to parse things out of the notes for some of our potential customers, some pilots we did, where just going into the notes and pulling out text that said, okay, what was maybe best for Jennifer was just to give her a call and ask how her cat was doing. Like literally, there were some patients where just a phone call was the right thing. You didn't have to get her to a mental health appointment. You didn't have to give her all kinds of medication. Just she liked being checked in on once a week. Well, what is that? Is that an event? Can we classify that as an event? Do they specifically put on there? Do they check a box that says we made a phone call? And can we say, okay, that's a potential treatment option that could lead to the best outcome? And that's really hard. It's almost impossible to do right now in our healthcare system, which is frustrating. But this is a really hard problem that it's a really challenging problem that AI can solve. So we're going to keep at it and keep thinking about it. But just real quick, here's another example. this is a real life case. Jennifer was a kind of a made up case, but this is a real life case where you had 2 patients that came into the hospital. Both have depression, different ages, different sexes. One came in through a referral, one came into the ER, one has cancer, one doesn't. So the question is, a lot of the times you do the same thing for these patients. You just throw, okay, they have to see a psychiatrist. You got to throw all this treatment at them that's expensive and that they're really not going to get any better doing. And they may even get more depressed versus maybe they don't need a mental health visit. And why is that? And this is where the predictors come in. And when you're talking about intellectual property, I'm going to get into this in a few minutes around data. Intellectual property around these prescriptive or these predictive variables or these features, these predictors, that is really, really gold in your AI model. Because if you know what those predictors are and you can capture those in a data set, right? If you can find 50 patients where you have those predictors and you have good outcomes, you can build a pretty accurate model and you have enough diversity, right? This is this idea of wide but shallow, right? Data, that idea I showed you I talked about it in the first slide. It's really powerful stuff. So here's some of these prescriptives or these predictors. I don't have them all here. We kind of keep them a little bit as a trade secret, some of the ones that we've studied in mental health. But obviously it's not just data you'll find in your EHR either. It's also social determinants of health, a real big buzzword right now. Back when we were thinking about this, it wasn't a big buzzword. But now it's like all you hear about is social determinants of health. Where do you live? What's your socioeconomic status? Variables that are, frankly, it does pry into a patient's life somewhat, and trying to understand this is not always what someone would want, and that's understandable. But these can help really drive what's the right prescribed treatment over time. Then, of course, you have to build a whole product around this. It's one thing to have the AI working and it works great. It's another thing to have the clinician press a button and it pulls the predictors for the patient. It goes out, it sees what the patient's already done. It goes out to the brain in the cloud, perhaps, and says, okay, what has the brain learned since the last time we treated Mrs. Jones? And what's the right, are we still on the right path for Mrs. Jones now? Very, very difficult to do. And I didn't realize how difficult that was until I got into it and realized, wow, we need a lot more money than I can raise around this. And that's why you see a lot of these AI companies raising so much money, because a lot of this stuff is still really hard to do well. And you got to, obviously, finding the right partners and working with them is really important. But the nice thing about being at an academic medical center is you can probably find people that can help you with each of these things for research purposes. But if you really want to scale it and commercialize it, it's really tough. So how do we succeed doing this? Ultimately, it's much easier said than done. The U.S. healthcare system kind of lives, in my opinion, in this space. This is another subject altogether, is whether we really get good data out of our systems. But let's assume you do. There are statistical analysis, there's clustering, there's filters. Management wants to see this at hospitals, right? They want to get a sense. But where we need to be is up here. We need to be doing more predictive analytics. We need to optimize treatments for people. That's where we're really going to see value in healthcare, save money, and get value out of all this data that we're collecting. So that's kind of where I see. But of course, the effort to do that is considerable. One more, Raiven, and this gets back to this idea of using AI with the Internet of Things, is the other technology we're working on, and we have a lot of interest in this. I don't know how much what kind of research focus you have, but Alzheimer's disease. So the National Institute on Aging felt that by 2025, this was back in about 2005, there was going to be a cure for Alzheimer's. The way the drugs were progressing through the system, through drug discovery and development, they thought one of these drugs is going to be it. And by 2025, we're going to have cures for Alzheimer's. That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. It has been very disappointing. And now the National Institute on Aging realizes we have an elderly population that we don't have enough caregivers, and we need to understand the progression of people's dementia or Alzheimer's over time. How do we do that? How do they do that in Japan? They use this crazy robot. This is a seal robot. And it's obviously, you think Japan, you think robots. They love these things. The elderly people use these all the time. It's kind of like a pet, right? The question is, can you get information from this, from the elderly person interacting with this, to be able to understand the progression of their either dementia, or if they're depressed? Can you follow them? Can you do this so it takes some of the stress off of the caregiver? So we're looking at solutions around that. And we just discovered that the government has put $40 million into an initiative with 3 different universities, Johns Hopkins, University of Massachusetts, and University of Pennsylvania, around this to fund pilot studies that we're hoping to get involved in at Raiven, to try and use data and AI to come up with some ways to better diagnose dementia or Alzheimer's disease, and then also manage patients, because we're going to have to manage this population for the next 20, 30 years. And hopefully the drugs do come to market, and there's people out there that are frantically working on this, but it's going to be a huge crisis. So if you're, once again, a really hard problem to solve, to understand, but the government's pumping money into this. So National Institute on Aging, their budget is huge right now because of our population. So, all right, back to data. So I think you get a sense of the challenges wherever you're working, getting the right kind of data. But data is a huge differentiator, and I think academic medical centers have a lot of potential to do this well. I don't think they have in general, but because unlike other organizations, you guys have the data. It's there in your hospital. It exists, but being able to organize it, put it in the right quality, is what is the challenges. In terms of coverage, I think these four qualities I like to look for in data. You have it. Academic medical centers have that. Is it consistent? Not so sure about that one. Does it tie back to common data entities, meaning kind of tying in with the hierarchical? Can you zoom in or drill down? I think a lot of that depends. So I think you can check the first box, but the other 3 are kind of are more challenging for just about anywhere. But if you're an investigator and you're wanting to do, and you have some ideas on how to use machine learning and AI, and you need data, you got to think about these things up front. And I have a picture of a janitor here, because essentially every data scientist I've seen that's worth their weight is a janitor first, meaning they don't even think about running this through algorithms until they do the janitorial work to get the data in the right format. And I'm not an expert on that, but that's something that I think all academic medical centers should be focused on, is having this kind of people that this is all they think about, is how to get the data in a right format so that it can be used to answer some of these research questions. Let's not think about outside of your university, outside your medical center, just to answer research questions that can help university investigators get the next grant, move their research forward, answer a question that they really wanted an answer to, that the data can help solve, that could lead to something bigger. If it leads to being able to develop a product around it, that would be great around AI. But if it just leads to help doing a better job on your research, I think that's really important. One resource I recommend is this group Databricks. They have a lot of great white papers. I've learned a lot from their website. And they make this look so simple, right? But really what they're talking about here are the 4 steps you need to do. You need to ingest diverse data. You need to process it in such a way that it can be scalable, so that you can actually create the models, and then the reproducibility. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. That's a huge problem. And then the delivery. How do you deliver it in the system? So really easy and straightforward, but just they do deeper dives into all these. So I recommend going to their website if you want to read some really good white papers that'll just kind of get your head around some of these things I'm talking about. So a couple more slides on data. So when you build let's say you get the right data at your medical center, you're able to get it, or get it from another source, wherever. There's a lot of publicly available sets that actually check all those boxes. You run your model. You use all of the tricks, and not tricks, but you use all of the standardized methods of AI. You train, you test, you change your data sets around, all those things. I'm not an expert on that, but you find the right data scientist who explains that to you. There's still, the problem is it's the best at that point. As soon as you deploy it in the real world, now the world's changed that it's in. It's going to deteriorate, and that's a concept known as concept drift. It's kind of an academic term. Industry doesn't think about it as much, but it's a real problem. In our case, what we thought, had we gotten to a point where we were consistently servicing customers, which we didn't, our idea was we were going to try and refit the model, right? So let's say there's 7 predictors that you need that solve a problem, and you're pretty sure those 7 predictors, you're not going to tell your customer what those are. That's your trade secret. You'll tell the customer, I need these 200 variables for all your patients. But you know that those 7 are going to be the ones that are going to really help drive the decision making. How they all work together, that's what's going on in the AI, in the brain. So you can refit the data. You can also prepare the data. Data preparation really is like, you can, as part of that, you can detect and remove changes. So you kind of have to know, you kind of have to anticipate if there's a change in the data, which is hard to do, getting into the weeds a little bit, but that's something they recommended, and I kind of scratched my head at that. This article just came out, this quote, which I was excited about. This once again gets to this idea of shallow and deep. So you can read that for yourself. Having 50 examples can explain what you wanted to learn. We saw that over and over again at Raiven, because you hear about big data and you need all this data. Well, if you're trying to figure out what kind of cancer someone has, the probability of that happening is so small, you need a lot of data. If you're just trying to optimize a solution for someone, optimize a treatment pathway, you don't need a lot of data. Now, you may need 50 examples for University of UTRF in Memphis. You may need 50 totally different examples than you would need at University of Tennessee Health System in Knoxville, because you have totally different populations. That's another key. The model that works in Memphis may not work in Knoxville. It may, but that gets to these kind of issues. But that doesn't mean you can't build good models. I want to leave about 10 minutes here for questions. So IP. I do not know this gentleman, but I stole all of his information, so I put his name, and he's in Nashville. He published an article about a year ago in the Nashville Business Journal, which I thought was fantastic. It was short, right to the point, something I think I'll definitely send to Richard and the team there. Just kind of went into what can you cover here? Patent algorithms, it really isn't about the algorithms. There's so many algorithms out there. Like I told you, we have these patented algorithms. By the time the patent prosecution was over, it was so narrow what our algorithms do, that it's pretty easy for someone to work around the prescriptive pieces. I still think coding it and getting it to work well is hard, but I think trade secret's the best option too. You can also kind of come up with frame the whole innovation as part of a larger system if you really need to patent it. So that gets into not only the algorithms, but how you get the data, what the output might look like. There can be possibly unique things there. The copywriting, the software, of course. And what I think is the key is if you come up with these predictors, these like 10 or 11 variables that really explain how the algorithm makes its decision. You're never going to tell it how it's too much, it's too deep in the weeds because it's constantly learning. But if there's 10 or 11 key variables that you know that you've seen on multiple data sets, and maybe some of them are completely obvious, but maybe some of them aren't. Well, that's something to protect. But if you put it out there, someone can just run it on a different algorithm, get that same data. There's nothing stopping them from doing that. So these predictors, I think, are kind of key to intellectual property protection. So finishing up with algorithms, they've shown that these algorithms, for certain imaging, I think in particular, the algorithm's more accurate than a human. So should we just do everything with algorithms? No, absolutely not. I don't prescribe to that at all. But they're still practicing medicine, and some of that is there's some gambles there. That's why I have a picture there of a casino. Humans cannot, and I kind of mentioned this before, this cognitive offloading. They can't integrate all this information, all the available information. I think the best problems with AI that will be solved is if you can integrate all this, you can give them a way to show them pathways, the ways for healthcare. Okay, what are my options? I didn't think about that option. That option is really good. And I just didn't think about it for this patient, but it makes sense. And then let's say the doctor follows that option. If they follow that option, then the algorithm learns and you get good outcomes data, then the algorithm learns, hey, that was a good option. Now, what if the doctor says, for this patient, my intuition tells me to go down this pathway. And let's say that's the right pathway. Well, the algorithm's still going to learn for that. What was it about that patient that the doctor decided not to go a different path? So it's working together. But the problem is there's misalignment of incentives, right? I mean, if a psychiatrist, if the algorithm tells the psychiatrist, you don't need to see this patient every week, are they going to cut off their recurring office visits? Probably not. If it's best for you not to see them and that's how they make money, then you have problems there. So I think the best partnerships, last slides here, the best partnerships are where the AI and the humans work together. So the first time that Kasparov lost, this was a big deal back in the 90s. He lost to, remember, IBM had this massive computer that beat him in chess. Well, they started having chess tournaments after that, where they had chess masters or just regular chess players, decent chess players, play against the computer or play against another chess player, and each one was allowed to bring in outside resources. What they found is the mediocre chess players could beat the masters, even when the masters had a computer, if those guys had the right algorithms and the right systems in place. They could beat the masters. Between their knowledge of chess and what algorithms they had and what they tuned, they could beat the masters. So it was a combination of things. It wasn't the expert and the expert algorithm that was necessarily winning. It was some combination thereof where they had the access to the right information at the right time. And this ties into, if you combine the algorithm and the human, you can get almost 100% accurate. Humans 97, algorithms 92. Why not be 100? Why not have access to the information? So I'm happy to take any questions. I just leave with this quote that I think is fascinating. That Sir William Osler founded Johns Hopkins Hospital I did my undergrad at Johns Hopkins. And so when I found this quote, I couldn't believe he said this long ago, but it really is true, especially when it comes to treating the whole patient. You need to understand the patient versus the disease that the patient has. So it's better to understand the patient. And I think that's where AI can be valuable to physicians and some of the technologies you might be working. So that's it for me. Happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Jim. And I think we've got about up to 5 minutes. If anyone has questions, you can either type them into the chat box, or if you want to unmute yourself and ask it, that's fine. While people, if in case they're talking, Jim, I'll start just with one question. So maybe I'm wrong, but you seemed a little bit skeptical of the explainable AI, buzzword or trend. I guess, did I read that correctly? And if so, could you go into that briefly?
Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about it. I wouldn't say I'm skeptical. I'm trying to figure out how. What happens in these algorithms is there's a bunch of weights, and the weights are changing, and it's kind of like the neurons in your brain that change over time. And so the question is, how are you going to explain that to someone? I think without always giving away your secrets, every secret you have, if you're trying to, have some sort of protection around this, is, explain to the end user, okay, can you tell me which variables do you think will be most important in this analysis for me to understand what's right for Mrs. Jones? Tell me your thought process. And if they hit 4 or 5, say, you're absolutely right, but there's other variables, there's other information you're not considering that the algorithm has access to for this patient that you may not have time to ask them or explain to them. And we didn't know if these variables would be important or not. But because we have this great data set, we were able to run it through the algorithm. We had the right data scientist, we ran it through the right algorithm, and this is what we found. So they may be like, oh, yeah. So, I think that's one way to explain it, is to try and kind of give away maybe a little bit of what you're doing on the front end to build the model. But there are more and more, there's research being done on that. I don't know a whole lot about it. Like I said, my colleague's been studying it.
Sure.
But I think it's a really good thing that this is not treated as a black box.
Okay. I guess one more chance. Does anyone have any questions before we let Jim go? 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm not hearing anything. Jim, I want to thank you again for giving us a great introduction, a great overview of your involvement in this, and Raiven Healthcare's engagement in this area that's exciting and forward looking, and obviously also challenging, and it's going to have plenty of ups and downs. So it's something that we'll all be following and probably living with, right, for the rest of our lives. So appreciate you coming in today, and again, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And just reach out anytime. I know we talked a little bit about some of the projects you guys have going on, and happy to give you advice on that. But you just gotta think about each of these little steps if you're thinking about a patent or some sort of protection. And I think just moving slowly through that and making sure you really have something with the data you have. Say, is this really the right data set we're using for this? And if you can't find it, then you just have to wait. You have to be patient. Then can we collect that? Can we work with someone to collect that data? But I think academic medical centers have huge potential in this to do this right. So I hope you guys can do that.
I hope so too. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks. You guys take care. Bye-bye.
And everyone, thank you for joining our webinar today, or rewatching it at utrf.tennessee.edu.